evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hannah Seligman, Branch Relations Associate at AAUW, and thank you all for joining us for this evening's AAUW Adelante book discussion. As most of you know, book clubs are a great way to engage in dialogue, meet new people, learn new things, and most importantly, to have fun. Many AAUW members share a love of reading. We have found more than 650 book groups across the AAUW community. This shared love of reading, partnered with a desire to seek out books written from diverse perspectives, launched a component of AAUW's Diversity Outreach Program in 1996, AAUW's Adelante Book of the Month Club. I hope you will all join us and engage in future book discussions in 2017. I also invite you to view the 2017-18 reading list, which is available on the AAUW website. I'm now going to turn the program over to my colleague, Ebony Avery Washington, Program Manager for the Legal Advocacy Fund. Ebony?
Hello, all, and welcome to this book club. We are going to have a good time for the next hour or so. We are going to be reviewing and discussing Breaking In, The Rise of Sonia Sotomayor and the Politics of Justice by Joan Biskupic. And we are fortunate enough to have her on the line. But before we start, I'd like to read her bio. CNN legal analyst Joan Biskupic has covered the United States Supreme Court for 25 years and written several books on the justices, including biographies of Sandra Day O'Connor and Antonin Scalia, and a political history of Sonia Sotomayor's historic appointment. Her work has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Explanatory Journalism and a finalist for the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Journalism. Before joining CNN, she was an editor-in-charge for legal affairs at Reuters News. Biskupic has also covered the Supreme Court for the Washington Post and for USA Today. During the 2016-17 academic year, Biskupic was a visiting professor at the University of California, Irvine. She holds a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center and is currently writing a biography of Chief Justice John Roberts, which I know we all can't wait to read. Joan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Ebony. I'm very pleased to be with you all tonight, and already see a couple of questions coming in that will be fun to answer.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to start right in here with some questions that were submitted to us before our event tonight. And so what people want to know is, what drew you specifically to Justice Sonia Sotomayor? We know you've authored other books about the justices, but we want to know what made her compelling or what sparked your interest about her.
That's a great question, because my first two seemed a little more predictable. I started with Sandra Day O'Connor out of my interest in politics more than the fact that she was the first woman, because I like to say that Sandra Day O'Connor came to the court knowing how to count votes, because she had been a former state legislator and she figured out how to best the men at their own game. And then it naturally led to Antonin Scalia after the Sandra Day O'Connor book, because he was much more of the true manifestation of the Reagan Revolution. And I had spent a lot of time in the Reagan papers when I was doing the Sandra Day O'Connor book. So then that gets us up to essentially 2009. I had just finished the Scalia book, and I know this is going to sound kind of strange, but once you get into the rhythm of writing books, you like to write books. So I was thinking, who would be my next subject? And that was in 2009, and that was when Sonia Sotomayor was appointed. And a couple things drew me to her, and it was much more the politics of her nomination, how she had become the one that presidents for so many years had wanted, the first Hispanic. You know, it's a distinction for the president as much as it is for the first justice. Ronald Reagan loved bragging about the fact that he had put Sandra Day O'Connor on the court. LBJ felt that it was one of his most significant accomplishments to name Thurgood Marshall. So I was very much aware of the cultural and political shifts that merged with Sonia Sotomayor's life and led to her appointment. I was also interested in the fact of kind of where America had gone in her 50-some years when she got appointed. She was born in 1954, which was the year of a very important case that many people had not known much about, Hernandez v. Texas. And that case marked the very first time that the Supreme Court had held that the Constitution protected Hispanics from discrimination with the same force as it protected blacks. And I thought her timing was so fortuitous throughout her entire life that she was in the right place at the right time to deliver what she had. So I became intrigued with her, but here's something that happened right from the start. I had gone to my prior publisher who had done the Scalia book. It was Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And they had started hearing that she was interested in selling her own autobiography, which was perfectly understandable. She had such a fabulous story to tell. And I was never going to do a straight bio of her because she had just gotten onto the court. You know, there was not a real history of her writings to detail. So I knew what she had in the works when I started, and that's what kind of made me veer toward much more of a political history than a biography, which made it kind of exciting and different from the others. And then once I started the book, she became such an interesting story in and of herself on the bench because she became a really different kind of justice.
Right, and it also made it interesting for us to read all those juxtapositions. You mentioned earlier that Sandra Day O'Connor was a vote counter, and we've come to know that all these judicial nominations are kind of are well choreographed, these appointments. So what is the significance of the title Breaking In? How was her rise or ascension to the Supreme Court different than others, do you believe?
Oh, that's a great question. And then I'll also tell you about some friction that came with that title, just because I think it would be interesting to the participants. Working on the title, the title is almost always like a really hard part of writing a book because you want a title that will grab people, but that will tell them something and won't be, repetitive of other court books that are out there. And she broke a barrier. That's number one. That kind of gave the publisher something to work with there. She was breaking a barrier. She broke in at so many different points in her life. She was a first. She was often a first from her neighborhood to go to Princeton, to get into Yale Law School. So breaking barriers worked. She also was somebody who, as you probably gather from her book, which I know many of you have read, and from her style, is that she is not going to wait her turn. She has a very strong personality that's just going to say, look, I know the answer, I know the question I want to ask, so I'm going to charge in. Now, I showed her the title to see if how she felt about it, and she was cool. And normally, you don't really run the book or the title by your subject if you're an independent journalist. But I showed it to her for a reason. It's because there were some people who, when we were testing the title out on folks, who thought that it might sound a little too edgy for the first Hispanic. And I didn't think there was any connotation, any negative connotation to it. But I thought just to be safe, I'd at least say, hey, Justice Sotomayor, what do you think of this title? And she had no trouble with breaking in. She probably wasn't crazy about the politics of justice because it's such a political book, but that wasn't what I was worried about. So that, it was the publisher who went with that, and I was fine with that. The only other thing that came up is that it was around the time that, what's the TV series, Breaking Bad? People were like, "Will it sound like Breaking Bad?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't watch that series." So anyway, so there were a couple. The main thing we wanted to convey was breaking through a barrier.
Right, and you conveyed that beautifully. And one of the other things that you conveyed was kind of giving us a good illustration of her unique style and how that kind of shaped her personal ambition and her skills, and also her network and how she had to build her network throughout her life, actually. Here at AAUW, our core value is empowering women and girls. And so I was curious, what do you think we can learn from Justice Sotomayor? What are the lessons that you think she can teach women and girls in pursuing their own careers?
Oh, there's so many, but I'll start with the networking one first because you mentioned that. In preparation for tonight's session, I was paging back through the book to refresh my own memory of different episodes that might come up through participants' questions. And I saw a line that she had said after she got on the district court in Manhattan. She was talking to a group of women, and she said, you don't just put in an application to get a job. You have to work for it. And she was talking about the networking. And boy, did she work for that district court judgeship that Senator Moynihan helped her achieve. So I would say, just to first of all, Ebony, respond to your initial suggestion about networking. She was all about that. She collected people. She still collects people. She keeps people. She is loyal to friends and acquaintances, and they are loyal in return. So that's number one. Number two, she worked so hard to learn what she didn't know and didn't have any fear of failure. I think a lot of us have a fear of failure or looking bad or maybe I'm not good at such and such. She could overcome that wonderfully. When she didn't know who Alice in Wonderland was, remember the reference in the classroom? She went and looked it up. She just plunged herself into lots of unfamiliar territory and got super smart. And I was reminded of how she graduated from Princeton. She graduates with honors. She's Phi Beta Kappa. She, again, at Yale, performs in such a high level. So she learned to master things that might have felt unfamiliar at first, given that given her early childhood.
Okay, and those are wonderful lessons that would serve us well if we all remembered and modeled ourselves after. So thank you for providing those illustrations of her rise within your book. I want to circle back to something that you mentioned, which for me was one of the most poignant themes that you developed in the book, and that was the notion of timing. And you mentioned it earlier in one of your earlier responses. You write, her assertion of her own identity coincided with increasing Latino visibility across America in the 1960s. And as I was reading, I was wondering about the interplay between timing and the notion of the timing being right and the climate being right, and balancing that with a person's personal ambition and skills. Do the stars have to align, or do you feel the stars aligned and that helped her get to where she is now, or was it heavy weighted on her own skills? Where does the balance? Is there a balance, and where did she fall on that scale?
I think it's somewhere in the middle, because we all have to be ready for our luck. We have to be prepared for when the stars align, and she certainly was. As I said, her timing, coming of age as the 1964 Civil Rights Act was in play, as people were much more interested in bringing in the value of diversity, which is exactly what Senator Moynihan was all about. It's what President Obama was all about in terms of their own choices, thinking there's a value here that we want to be part of. So she was able to take advantage of that, but she would not have been able to take advantage of that unless she was ready and highly qualified. President Obama was not going to choose someone who he didn't feel had all the right stuff. And Senator Moynihan the same when she got onto the district court. In fact, I found the correspondence between him and folks on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he's bragging about the fact that at Princeton she had won this top honor called the Pine Prize and that she was Phi Beta Kappa. And when President Obama was trying to figure out did he want her, he went to some of the judges on the Second Circuit and said, what has she been like as a judge? And then he read some of her opinions. So she had to have the right stuff at the right time. Interestingly, in some ways, Sandra Day O'Connor had the right stuff, but it didn't appear that way. When she was nominated in 1981, she was not on a federal court. She had not served on any federal court, and she was only on an intermediate state court in Arizona. She was very qualified in her own way, but not in traditional ways, whereas Sonia Sotomayor had all the traditional markings by this point in 2009 because she had served for many years on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in Manhattan, based in New York, but then also had been a trial judge. So she was super experienced and had the Ivy League credentials that so many presidents like to brag about. So I guess it would be being ready for your luck, being ready to have the stars aligned. You can't just wait for it. You have to have that nice combination of preparation that makes you ready when your opportunity comes.
That's an excellent phrase. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to try to be ready for my luck in the coming years. You just make a interesting juxtaposition between the qualifications of Justice O'Connor and Justice Sotomayor, and you make a juxtaposition as well earlier on in the book between Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan, calling Justice Kagan the shrewd tactician and Justice Sotomayor the solo operator. What part, if any, do you think Justice Sotomayor's approach was shaped by her Puerto Rican heritage?
I think she had to be confident in herself that she was different. The two of them are so interesting to watch. There's another phrase in the book that I use where I think of Elena Kagan as being very aware of herself as of one of nine. She's always trying to figure out how to bring along other justices, how she fits in. She is a very savvy operator among many. Sonia Sotomayor is very much separating herself in subtler ways where she doesn't want to compromise as much on her opinions. She basically she'll write alone a lot. She'll write concurring opinions, even and stake out her ground rather than maybe modify her opinion a little bit to get other votes. And I think that comes from the fact that she was a solo operator throughout her younger career. When she was the one person from her neighborhood who ends up at Princeton. Then she becomes even at Yale, she had this great Princeton background, but she was one of the few, the married student who, was doing other things. I think she's someone who's maybe it is her Latino background, maybe it is just how she came up. It might be just core personality. But I think you might remember also, Ebony, when she moved when she set up offices in the court, she went ahead and took this third floor suite, which is all by itself up there, and kind of just went about her own life of writing the book, doing all her speaking gigs, in a way that made her voice heard beyond the court much more than Elena Kagan's.
it's interesting how those formative year experiences kind of shape how we travel through life. And it seems like a lot of that happened for her and shaped how she approached adversity and even success.
That's right. That's right. And, you just mentioned the word adversity, and here's another lesson that any of us, young or old, should always have. She faced a lot of adversity and just kept going. I think we all face things big and small. Probably many of us might not have even had the challenges that she had, but we all have challenges of different sorts. And she, just like being ready for her luck, she somehow was ready for her adversity too. She had developed strategies early on, perhaps as a Latina, perhaps as somebody who had diabetes at a young age. Think of that. I was struck by some of her early recollections of having diabetes. Also, someone who had a lot of tension in the family between her mother and father. There's just a lot to overcome to then move about in her young world, and I think that served her very well for moving about in her adult world.
Definitely, we can see that. Now let's move to a silly topic, and that would be the topic of her looks or her appearance. Her signature bright nail polish and flashy jewelry have been scrutinized by media outlets and court watchers. It was noted by many that during the confirmation hearings, Justice Sotomayor minimized the nail polish and the hoop earrings, yet they returned after she was confirmed, and they're likely here to stay. You create a lot of wonderful illustrations in the book of how notably different she has been in many and most situations throughout her life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I cannot overstate what a button-down crowd the Supreme Court is. The male justices all, obviously all look alike, but and dress alike most of the time, and the two women who preceded her, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, were of a button down in their own way. Although I have to say about Ruth Bader Ginsburg right now, and her clothing is incredibly creative and distinctive when she's outside of the black robe, but it's still within kind of more of a traditional sense, even though she has a fabulous sense of style that nobody would ever call Brooks Brothers type style, as you might of Sandra Day O'Connor, somebody who was a little more standard in pearls and skirts. But Sonia Sotomayor with the wonderful hoop earrings and the more casual approach to things, I think it was her. It was her. She told me this one story about showing up at a dinner party that she thought was going to be a very small little occasion. And it turned out that the hostess had invited lots and lots of people, and they were all dressed to the nines, and she had on like sweater and slacks. And I said, did you feel self-conscious? And because, I was thinking, in Washington, would you feel self-conscious? And she said, no, I'm kind of used to it. She basically said, I am used to being who I am, period. And I thought that was a gift that she learned early in life. And if she's self-conscious about things like dressing in establishment Washington, she keeps it to herself, and she just has a, I am who I am attitude. And you can tell we're all looking at the cover picture. It's not that she doesn't have all her suits, and she's been wearing suits ever since she was a prosecutor, I'm sure, from her early days as a lawyer. But she's someone who isn't automatically going to be dressing up all the time the way Ruth Bader Ginsburg tends to. And probably many of the male justices do. I'm trying to think which ones I can even recall not wearing cufflinks. It's generally a formal group.
And that was one of the things I enjoyed a lot about the book, is that you make clear that she seems to be resolved to kind of honor herself and her own identity. And she seems to be like very aware of who she is and kind of remains true to that throughout. So thank you for that, because I really enjoyed that aspect of the book and many aspects of the book. You just talked about, you mentioned Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has kind of experienced some pop culture fame these past couple of years as, what is she called, the notorious RBG, yes. And so we've had many firsts on the court. Can we talk about any cultural significance or pop cultural significance that the first Latina justice provide for us?
Yes, and I'm going to just do a slight detour on RBG for a second. It just goes to show that no matter how old any of us are, we can always have second and third acts, because Justice Ginsburg came on when she was roughly 61 years old to the Supreme Court in 1993. And she, she was a very fine justice, not known all that well to the American public. People who knew of her before she went on the court probably knew of her pioneering women's rights work in the legal field. But she has had this really unusual star turn in her late 70s and 80s, and I guess we could all just hope for that, that there are always many chapters ahead. Now, in terms of the cultural icon elements to Sonia Sotomayor, I don't know how many of you saw the pictures recently of her at Yankee Stadium. She's a huge Yankees fan, and she likes that as part of her identity. So she does that. She loves parties, and she throws parties, goes to parties. She loves to dance. There were so many stories I was told about when she took salsa lessons and was dancing throughout the Second Circuit courthouse, and then she danced with one of the Jorge Ramos had written a very nice blurb, advance praise for my book, and I went to see him then afterward to do his television show, and he said that he enjoyed so much dancing with her. She's definitely in the mix with culture, and she knows. I'd be talking to her, and she'd raise the names of various pop stars, Latino and not Latino, and I'd be lost. And I'm a little bit younger than her, but so she's definitely out there. And I know she has a following among young people, and she likes to go speak to student groups. She especially likes to speak to children, of color and children who might not be exposed to Supreme Court justices to be a role model.
And she is. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to my second and third act. Given your 25 years experience covering the Supreme Court, I'm going to ask you to make a prediction. Who or what demographic do you think might be the next first for us on the Supreme Court?
Well, for a first, we probably will need a different president, I would think, because when I think about the names on Donald Trump's short list, they've been, in terms of their demographics or anything a little bit different about them, they haven't been different. They've been, they've had counterparts on the court already, like a Justice Scalia or a Anthony Kennedy. So I think it's unlikely that we would get a first. Well, there's a small chance we could get a first Asian American, but I don't quite think so. But I would think the first Asian American could be coming at some point over the next couple of years, or I'd say, maybe the next 5-ish years. I don't know when we would get the first openly gay individual on the Supreme Court. None of the individuals on President Trump's list would meet that. And I don't know how many, whether that would even be a presidential priority, but I think the first Asian American would be a presidential priority of both Republicans and Democrats. Whereas with a Democratic president, there were times when we thought, for example, there's a man by a wonderful judge by the name of David Tatel on the D.C. Circuit, who is highly, highly accomplished and happens to be blind. And for a while, people thought he could potentially be a Supreme Court appointee because of his just all that he had overcome. And again, as I said, having exactly the highest credentials in addition to having some other first with him. And there are some younger men and women who are coming up through the system who are Asian American. So I guess to answer your question, I'd go with that.
Okay, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your opinions on that, and we'll all be watching, I'm sure. Let's jump back into the book, and I want to read an excerpt here. The justices varied in their personal assessments, as is natural with any group. Some found Sotomayor warm, amiable. Others found her abrupt and exacerbating. At the human level, these differences with her were not small. In the larger scheme of the law, they were. Can I have you elaborate on that excerpt?
Yes, and I took some care in writing that, and I think what comes after that is a reference to the fact that when all is said and done, the differences on this court with Justice Sotomayor are really small compared to where the court was at earlier in the 1900s when it was all men and they were all at each other's throats, the old 9 scorpions in a bottle. And there have been times on the Supreme Court where individual justices didn't even talk to each other. We don't have that. We don't have that at all. So I wanted to capture a bit of the tensions, a bit of the conflicts, and some of the personality differences, but I didn't want to make too big of a deal of it. So that sort of sentiment is mainly in that section that you just read. But it was there. It's there, and it's there with my current subject a little bit too. In fact, Chief Justice John Roberts and Sonia Sotomayor are they definitely have conflicting personal styles. Let's just put it that way. So you kind of want to clue people into that, and you want to give, they're human beings. So you want to suggest some of the tensions that can manifest themselves around the table. But you also want to say, when all is said and done, they're voting on the law, and they're all appointed for life, so there are incentives to get along. So even if there's some eye rolling, and believe me, there's some eye rolling when Justice Sotomayor, dominates the oral argument at times, and even if that occurs, they tend to just make sure they can work together, and they close ranks if they feel like anybody's been attacked from the outside.
Okay, thank you. We did talk about kind of how that race, gender, and class kind of drives skepticism or can prompt eye rolling. It is there, and we know that they are a tight body. I wonder if you can speak to any age issues that pop up. As you pointed out, or as we all know, that these are appointments for life, and she is younger. So is there any skepticism that arises because of her age or just the justice's age?
I don't think so, actually, because, she was born in 1954. Elena Kagan was born in 1960. The chief was born in 1955. And we have Neil Gorsuch, who just turned 50, I believe, just this year. So she was actually appointed at a time when she wasn't that young compared to, for example, the chief, who was appointed in 2005 4 years before her. So he actually had kind of more of a small age issue because he was so much younger at the time than the rest of them. So I don't think it was age. I think it was she was just going to be herself and let the chips fall where they may kind of person. And I think it was a little bit, it is still a little bit more just her. That's her. That's her. She's just going to go her own way and not be hemmed in and not let others define her. I think that's one thing. She doesn't, just as she's not self-conscious as she tries new things and works her way into any difficult territory, I find that just from watching her, she doesn't seem to want to alter her behavior just because somebody wants to be critical of it. You know, when in her early years on the bench, there was a lot of talk about how much she interrupted. She didn't really stop that. and Justice Scalia didn't stop that either. There was some talk about whether critics of Sonia Sotomayor's approach on the bench were being sexist because they gave Scalia a pass sometimes, and Scalia was constantly interrupting and kind of acting out in court. And he was criticized, but he wasn't criticized in the same way. And we saw, as I mentioned in the book, there was a little bit more of a subtle criticism of her at the time of her nomination from people like Harvard University's Larry Tribe and Jeff Rosen, a little more subtle than we would have expected at an earlier time when we'd have a nominee of color.
And one of the things I learned reading the book is that she was not on the short list of President Obama's. Can you talk more about that?
Actually, she was.
Oh,
what are you thinking of? What are you thinking of?
I think it was earlier on in the book you mentioned that he had compiled a short list, and some of his mentors she was not on the list, and some of his mentors, I think, were critical when she appeared on the list, I believe.
You might be thinking of the Larry Tribe incident, but I think, and again, I'm trying to remember where I might have suggested otherwise, but given her experience on the Federal Appeals Court, given the fact that she would be the first Latina, and he was a Democratic president who had made diversity on the bench a priority, I think that she was included pretty much from the beginning. And if she wasn't, it might have been just I just truly don't remember her not being included in some way throughout.
It's nice to be able to get clarification from the author, so thank you very much for that.
Sure.
I want to talk about if it's too early to talk legacy. I think she'll be entering, her 9th term on the court. Is it too early to discuss her judicial legacy on the Supreme Court?
Already she's made her mark in terms of, again, concurrences or dissents, where she strikes out on her own to say, you, majority, should look more seriously at some of these issues involving defendants' rights. That's where she's made her mark. She calls attention to a lot of important issues having to do with criminal trials. She's let me think if there is another. She's the only one on the bench right now who was a trial lawyer, and that gives her a very helpful perspective. I think that just the way that she highlights issues involving prisoner disputes is important. I do think that so much of her legacy could be off the bench just because she's so visible and has become such a role model for so many, and she's out there all the time speaking to people. I believe she might be doing another book, maybe for children. I'm not sure yet if that's what's in the works, but I would think that she's the kind of person who will keep up a very high public presence. Right now on the law, there's not any set of majority opinions that I would point you to say, look at what she's crafted here. But that takes time. Sandra Day O'Connor, who became so influential in the 90s, remember, it was in the 90s. It took some changes in the bench for Sandra Day O'Connor to become such a crucial justice. She was a swing vote for a while, even in the 80s, but it was in the 90s when she became very, very powerful. And then Anthony Kennedy picked up that role, but only after Sandra Day O'Connor left. So just like with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in another chapter here, we might see another chapter of Sonia Sotomayor that goes much more to how she will influence the court in terms of jurisprudence.
Okay. One of the chapters in the book is titled, I Am the Perfect Affirmative Action Baby. And you outlined that was a quote from her earlier in her career. What do you see as the future of affirmative action in the United States?
That's a great question because I've been following it at every turn. So let me tell you two things that have happened. In 2016, the Supreme Court, with Justice Kennedy's vote, he actually switched votes to uphold the University of Texas affirmative action program. And it's a narrowly crafted program that takes race into consideration with many other factors for diversity on campus. And it was the first time that Anthony Kennedy had voted for that, which looked like a strong endorsement of keeping alive Bakke, which dates to 1978, and keeping alive Sandra Day O'Connor's writing in 2003. But what's happened is that with the Trump administration, it's now come in on a couple matters having to do with affirmative action in test cases brought not by white people claiming reverse discrimination, but by Asian Americans. And in fact, there's a major case percolating at Harvard that you'll probably hear more about in upcoming years that could ultimately affect affirmative action more. But for right now, since 2016, when we had that University of Texas ruling, it was still alive and well, at least in states where you didn't have state laws like in California forbidding it, or states and private institutions are free to engage in affirmative action, not quotas, as the Supreme Court said back in 1978. You can't have quotas, but you can use race as one of many criteria in trying to build a diverse campus.
Thank you. We appreciate your expertise on that issue. I'm wondering, has, justices are to interpret the law, and in doing so, they establish the law of the land. And it's a pretty, I guess, black and white thing, but I'm wondering if the presence of Justice Sotomayor has changed the way the Supreme Court debates issues like race.
I think so, and I think it happened, back when Thurgood Marshall was there. Thurgood Marshall made a big difference in the conference room with Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and William Brennan and even Anthony Kennedy when they overlapped. They talked about that. They talked about the effect he had on them. And the other thing I have to say is the law isn't as black and white as people like to say, because think of how these folks all differ. The Constitution is actually a very slim document. It's a set of guidelines that the justices apply along with precedent that's built up through the years. And it's helpful sometimes to think of a series of guiding principles that have been reinforced through certain cases that point the way for these justices and lower court judges. And I've had this discussion with judges who might be more conservative and say, well, it's always going to come out the way the law says. Well, if it's going to come out the way the law says, why is there so many differences? Why would I was in a conversation actually at one point with another justice on the court who would never vote the way Sonia Sotomayor does on really hot button cases. And he was trying to tell me that there's just, a standard set of rules and it's going to come out based on those rules. And I said, well, you feel like you're following those rules, and I'm sure Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg feel like they're following rules too, and you're not coming to the same conclusion. So there's play in the joints, and some of it, they all say, oh no, it's not coming from personal experience, but it's coming from their idea of how the Constitution should be interpreted over time and how earlier cases point these justices in ways that might not be exactly the same. And I think her experiences definitely illuminate issues of discrimination. I would point you to one of her most poignant dissents, and it was her first dissent from the bench, and it was in 2014, a Michigan affirmative action case called Schuette, and she talked about the slights and the snickers and the feelings of inadequacy that someone of color would feel, that even though she wasn't saying that I, Justice Sotomayor, feel, but it was clear that what she was writing was informed by her own experiences.
Right. And you do speak of kind of that genuineness that pervades her career throughout the book. And I want to thank you for that black and white clarification, because you're right. I did just put a lot of attorneys out of business with my assessment that the law is black and white. So thank you for that. We don't want to do that. I know the 2017 term, I believe, is going to start in October.
Right.
Are there any pending issues before the court that you think Justice Sotomayor is going to take a particular interest in?
Oh, yes. Let's see. Well, first of all, we have a good political gerrymandering case. That's how state legislatures draw their district lines for members of Congress and for the State House. And we know that the Supreme Court has laid down certain rules for drawing lines based on race, but it's never wanted to get into the business of saying yes or no to highly political boundaries that can really affect elections. And I think she's got a political savviness, as Justice O'Connor did, and I think that case would definitely be of interest to her. Another case that you hear people talk about that I think would be of interest to her, not so much because of her own distinct background, but because it's an important civil rights issue, and that's the tension in gay rights and religious rights. We have a case from Colorado where a Christian man who runs a bakery didn't want to bake a cake for a gay couple. And these issues are tough because it doesn't have to do with the issue of whether somebody can get married. It's whether somebody in a private business has to would be guilty of discrimination if he didn't want to bake a cake. So I think that's going to be kind of a tough one for the justices. And I think just because it's an important civil rights matter and religious liberties matter, she would take a strong interest in that. I'm trying to think of any other one that's coming up that would play specifically to minority rights. We've got some voting rights cases beyond the political gerrymandering one heading up to the court too. And of course, so many of these will matter in 2020 and 2018 for the next two election cycles.
Well, we will all be watching, and we look forward to hearing your expert commentary on CNN about all the things that are coming in this next Supreme Court term. You mentioned that you are currently working on your next project, which is about Chief Justice John Roberts. Anything you want to disclose about that?
Well, he's more interesting in some ways than my first three. as a superficial matter, he's not as interested because he's, a man born in 1955, with family from, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and he grew up in Indiana. There's nothing first or interesting demographically like the first woman, the first Italian American, or the first Latina, but he's an interesting figure as the Chief Justice of the United States, and I'm trying to figure him out, and also how to make you, all of you listening today, how to make you interested in him as a figure of history, of a figure who's controlling things on the court, who can be mostly predictable as a conservative justice, but then gave us that surprising Obamacare vote in 2012, which ended up saving the Affordable Care Act. So I'm hoping that I figure out a way to make him as interesting as these first three.
Okay, well, thank you. We look forward to that. And I'm not going to ask you who's next after that. We'll just have to wait and follow you to find that out.
Thank you.
So we have one last question for tonight that I'll be asking after we go back to Hannah. In advance of this evening, you provided us with a few additional reading recommendations for those who want to delve more deeply into some of the topics that we've discussed tonight. Could you walk us through some of those additional reading, some of the additional reading you provided?
Sure. Now, I can't imagine that all of you haven't at least been aware of My Beloved World by Sonia Sotomayor. So that I won't have to say too much about that, because that's her book, and you can get it on audio tape, and you can get it on in paperback and everything now. Sandra Day O'Connor was my first book, and I still think that she's quite an inspiration to people, especially, again, women who are breaking barriers in a political sense and learning how to just keep plowing ahead despite adversity. And she was quite a figure, and she's still alive. She's 87 now, so I think she's interesting to get to know. Justice Scalia was so important for the conservative movement, and if there's anyone in your group who is really interested in the Reagan Revolution, the Federalist Society, and the whole change in America from a more liberal inclination after the Warren Court to what Justice Scalia and, frankly, this current Supreme Court is all about, that would be good for those kinds of readers. And he was fun. He sat for a dozen interviews, so his voice is throughout that book. Becoming Harry Blackman by my longtime colleague Linda Greenhouse takes advantage of Harry Blackman's personal papers at the archive in Washington, and that's a good read, especially if you're interested in Roe v. Wade, which was the most important ruling that Justice Blackman wrote. Roe v. Wade in 1973 made abortion legal nationwide. My Grandfather's Son by Clarence Thomas is a very good book. It's his personal memoir. It's kind of a counterpart. His came out about 10 years before My Beloved World, but it has some of the same themes as Sonia Sotomayor's about his struggle as a young man being raised by his grandfather and grandmother after his parents' family split up when he was a small boy in Pinpoint, Georgia. And then for more broader coverage of the Roberts Court, that's where I put in the book by Marcia Coyle, which is a great overview of the current Roberts Court, and the one by Larry Tribe and Josh Matz is another kind of broad look if you're interested in learning more about the court as a whole. Jeffrey Toobin is quite an engaging writer, and he pit essentially the President Obama against Chief Justice John Roberts in that book, and that's kind of interesting. The title of the oath comes from that botched oath that they had the first time the chief was swearing in President Obama in 2009. And then finally, for those of you who might be looking for a much more opinionated take on the Supreme Court, one that would be a little bit more liberal or much more liberal, it's Erwin Chemerinsky's book. And Erwin is a great scholar of all things Supreme Court, and in fact his latest book that I'll just mention, even though it's not on this list because it's not about the Supreme Court, is about free speech on campus. And it's very, very good. And he comes at these things with a very liberal sensibility. So it's more to the left than, for example, the Tribe, Matt's book, which tries to be right there in the center.
So thank you for all those great suggestions. We have a lot to read. And I want to thank you also for hosting such a wonderful discussion about your book. We enjoyed reading it, and we will definitely share it with our respective networks. It has been a pleasure, Joan, to talk to you about the book and your upcoming projects, as well as to share kind of you sharing some of your expertise with us. So we've greatly appreciated it.
Thank you all, and happy reading. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Now we're going to return back to Hannah, who's going to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you, Ebony, for doing a fantastic job moderating. We so appreciate you contributing your time and your expertise on legal matters. Thank you again to Joan as well. We appreciate her taking the time out of her very busy schedule to speak to us. And, of course, thank you to everybody who joined us. We always love having you guys come on and submit questions and participate in these discussions. And we hope to see you all at our next Adelante book discussion, which will be taking place on October 26th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be talking to Dr. Kim Nielsen, who's on the faculty at the University of Toledo, and she will be discussing her book, A Disability History of the United States, which is a comprehensive look at U.S. history through a lens of disability and able-bodiedness. So be sure to join us for that. So with that, thank you, everyone, and good night.